In May alone, the Gold Board had exported 11 tons of gold valued at USD 1.1 billion. Actually, it's in May alone. The Gold Board exported 11 tons of gold valued at 1.1 billion US dollars. Cumulatively from January, exports from the small-scale sector reached 51.5 tons.
Ghana just made $3 billion in only 4 months, without discovering a single new gold mine. So how did they pull it off? Here's a hint. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had something to do with it. But what's the real story behind this unexpected windfall? Let's dive in. Sitting firmly in Africa's Golden Triangle with South Africa and Sudan, it was a top-tier producer. But in spite of this natural wealth, the nation hardly ever benefited from its hidden gems. Year after year, billions of dollars worth of gold left Ghana, but only remnants returned to the country's economy. Lack of ownership was the issue, not a shortage of gold. With everything but no control, this has been the silent tragedy of Ghana's mining industry. Foreign multinational corporations with headquarters in Canada, the UK, South Africa, and Australia were primarily in charge of running the nation's gold mines. Under private contracts, these businesses extracted the gold, processed it abroad, and then sold it to customers throughout the world. The role of Ghana: take a little cut, supply the dirt, and avoid the boardrooms where the real money is earned. The gold wasn't the only thing that remained. It leaves behind data, pricing control, and profit transparency. Numerous mining companies underreported their profits, took use of legal loopholes, or just set up their operations in ways that allowed for tax evasion. The riches had already vanished abroad, concealed in offshore accounts and business spreadsheets, by the time government officials became involved. Ghanaians pondered for years how we could have so many resources and yet face unemployment, debt, and a weak currency. So far, the response has been silence. Silence thereafter became the norm. Early in 2025, however, numbers, rather than a protest or a politician, broke that stillness. Silent, emotionless figures. Ghana's gold earnings soared to $2.7 billion between January and April. That is more than 3 times what it made during the same time frame only 2 years prior. Furthermore, in just 4 months, the quantity of gold exported virtually doubled, rising from about 7,500 kilograms in early 2023 to over 30,000 kilograms. These were neither estimations or optimistic forecasts. These were actual transactions that were documented in Ghana's central bank's books and monitored by the country's customs department. Naturally, people wanted to know where all of this originated. Was there a fresh gold deposit discovered by Ghana? Did the output of mining suddenly increase overnight? The response was much more significant and fascinating. There was always gold. Ghana simply stopped allowing it to disappear. It was not the mines that changed. Who was in charge of the exits changed. Ghana wasn't allowing private corporations to control what was left on the ground or where it went for the first time. Now a gatekeeper was present. A fresh idea that wasn't from Accra was standing outside that fence. It originated in Ouagadougou, a nearby capital. The Ghanaian government had not simply happened onto a fortunate quarter, you see. They were no longer content to be a passive participant in the mining industry after studying something and observing someone. Motivated by fresh leadership on the continent, they had taken a very conscious decision. However, we must examine the impact that led to that change in order to comprehend how a silent policy decision generated billions of dollars in unexpected revenue. Not even the African Union, not the International Monetary Fund, and not a think tank. It came from Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a man in a green beret, a soldier rather than a scholar, a leader who had seized a nation that was in disarray and dared to defy the laws of international economics. The new model was not created in Ghana, but they didn't hesitate when they saw it. They modified it. Gold ceased to be an export as soon as they did. It turned into a weapon of state power. However, how did Ghana's parliament learn of Traore's activities in Burkina Faso? And why would a civilian leader without any military experience, President Mahama, choose a paradigm derived from a military revolution? Understanding what Traore stood for, not just as a person, but also as an idea, is essential to understanding how Ghana went from being a passive observer to the guardian of gold. Ghana's capital, Accra, was not where the wave of transformation that the country experienced started. Under the leadership of a 36-year-old military officer, with no economic training, no Wall Street support, and no worldwide recognition, it started in Burkina Faso. However, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has the clarity and bravery to state what others could only whisper. Contracts, not guns, are used to steal Africa's wealth. That lucidity reverberated well beyond his boundaries. Many people wrote Traoré off when he took office in 2022 as just another military leader in a weary area accustomed to coups. However, he subsequently took an odd action. The state was not privatized by him. He did not plead for money from the IMF. Instead, he cried, "Stop," as he gazed at the gold that was leaving his nation. He constructed a national refinery, outlawed raw exports, and insisted on selling no grams unless the Burkina people profited first. It shook cities from Paris to Washington and was a direct assault on post-colonial economic reasoning. However, it caused a different response in Accra. Interest was aroused. It was silent at first. There are a few whispers in Ghana's parliament, data from think tanks, and cautious conversations in business circles. Would a more developed democracy like Ghana be able to implement such a daring model? Would a nation with ties to global trade networks dare to eliminate the intermediaries? When John Dramani Mahama took office again in early 2025, it was the true test. The previous administration of Mahama had been criticized for upholding the status quo and had experienced economic challenges. However, something was different this time. He returned with structural aim rather than ostentatious speeches. The indicators became evident in a matter of weeks. Mahama had no intention of repeating the same old strategy. Rather, he was getting ready to completely redo it. What about the lone blueprint on his desk? The World Bank did not provide it. It originated in Burkina Faso. Why would a democratic civilian president use a military-led revolution as a model for his economic recovery? The findings hold the answer. Traore had done more than merely speak. He produced quantifiable successes. His gold reforms stabilized the value of the local currency, quadrupled national reserves, and even helped Burkina Faso become less reliant on foreign aid. African leaders perceived it differently from Western observers, who characterized it as radical. Evidence. Mahama had no intention of borrowing a uniform. He was using a practical formula that he borrowed. Additionally, Mahama had more international recognition, a more developed banking system, and better infrastructure than Traore. That implied that he could carry out Traore's actions, but more quickly, on a larger scale, and with less internal opposition. So he started to lay the foundation. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. Silently, the shift's first indication appeared: the establishment of the Ghana Gold Board, a new national organization to regulate gold. It wasn't your average bureaucracy. It was modeled after the national management of mineral wealth in Burkina Faso. It sought to eliminate foreign control over gold decisions, much to Traore's idea. But it was more than just structure that inspired it. Mahama started repeating the deeper premise of Traore. Gold is more than just an item. It's power in politics. Furthermore, African states would never have complete sovereignty over it until they had direct authority over it. Mahama adopted a more stern approach than other administrations, which had been prepared to bargain with foreign miners for better conditions. You must follow Ghana's rules if you desire its gold. For a period, this was not merely an economic policy. It had to do with realigning ideologies. Through tax holidays and investment conferences, Ghana was sending a message to the world that it no longer considered wealth to be something to be attracted. It believed that wealth was already buried beneath its feet and was now prepared for defense. Adopting the Traore model, of course, involved more than simply copying and pasting policies. Ghana had to modify it to fit the situation. Ghana was a democracy with established investor ties and a regional financial center, in contrast to Burkina Faso. It had no money for a shock tactic. It required a silent revolution that would attract attention without provoking retaliation. Mahama created precisely that. Once impossible regulations were enacted into law in a matter of weeks. Unless they adhered to stringent national laws, foreign gold traders were shut out. Every ounce of exported gold went through the Ghana Gold Board, and multinational corporations were compelled to give up a portion of their output for state reserves. Without the trust of a living example, none of this would have occurred. Traore then gave Mahama that permission to be brave, but not a direct relationship. It wasn't simply policy that followed. It turned a profit, and power accompanied that profit. Not only monetary strength, but also diplomatic clout. The true game changer, however, was yet to come. Because the question of what Ghana will do with the gold arose once they gained control of it. Ghana took a non-philosophical turn after adopting the Traore model. It was useful. Retake command and secure the vault. There was no going back. Legislation has evolved from inspiration. This was the most difficult aspect, though: enforcement. At that point, Ghana showed audacity in a way that astounded both domestic and international onlookers. The Ghana Gold Board, the new state authority charged with regulating the industry, was established. The Mahama government didn't waste any time. It introduced a series of measures that completely changed the balance of power and altered the nation's mining regulations. The required 20% door bar handover was among the initial surprises. This gesture was not symbolic. It was an order. Before they could export a single ounce of refined gold, all mining companies in Ghana, whether domestic or foreign, had to physically turn over 20% of their stock to the gold board. Why do you have bars? Because it's easy to manipulate raw gold. It may be sold off by dubious means, underreported, or contaminated. However, semi-pure gold bars can be tracked down. It's a fingerprint of finances. Ghana ensured it was viewing what was true, not what was announced, by requiring this form. Foreign corporations accustomed to exporting gold under private contracts with little government supervision were immediately under pressure from this strategy. They needed to prove everything now. They didn't like it either. A few companies vowed to withdraw. Others discreetly lobbied to loosen the regulations. Ghana, however, remained steadfast. Supported by surging gold prices throughout the world and a populace fed up with being robbed legally, Mahama's government called their bluff. And the results arrived quickly. The reserves of Ghana's central bank started to increase. International financial experts were astonished by the sudden increase in gold holdings from less than 9 metric tons to over 30 tons within 3 months of the new policy. These weren't screen-based digital numbers. This tangible gold, which was kept in state vaults, stood for genuine independence and worth. Monetary sovereignty came along with the gold. Like many African countries, Ghana has historically relied on foreign exchange reserves, primarily in the form of US dollars, to stabilize its currency and cover import costs. However, dollars are subject to political pressure, currency fluctuation, and IMF requirements. Gold. There is no master for gold. Equipped with a vast supply of a widely valued resource, Ghana started to retaliate in nuanced yet effective ways. Once dictating strict terms, international lenders now had to engage in negotiations. Previously demanding tax vacations, investors now had to contend with a growing local industry. Even Ghana's central bank could afford to manage the city, the country's currency, with greater assertiveness. However, this increased authority went beyond economics. It was calculated. Ghana changed its trade strategy by leveraging its growing reserves. It started looking into barter agreements and bilateral trade using gold as collateral, rather than only depending on deals denominated in dollars. There were rumors of negotiations to send refined gold to countries in Asia and the Middle East in return for investments in infrastructure, machinery, and energy without affecting the financial institutions in the West. And there was one unbreakable rule at the heart of this change. Unless Ghana makes money, its gold stays in Ghana. Another significant measure taken by Mahama's administration to uphold this regulation was to virtually completely ban international gold traders. The new policy tightened the ring, in contrast to the previous period when dozens of foreign companies, particularly from the UAE and Switzerland, prowled Ghana's marketplaces, snatching up gold at below-market rates. The export environment was now restricted to businesses that had been vetted and sanctioned by the state. Additionally, they were subject to stringent regulations pertaining to taxation, transparency, and reinvestment in the local economy. Critics initially cautioned that this would drive away customers. However, the reverse took place. A new generation of local business owners and investment organizations emerged as a result of the government's promises and the clear regulations. Once stifled by foreign domination, small and mid-sized Ghanaian businesses started constructing trading houses, logistical networks, and refining facilities. They didn't have to request permission anymore. For them, the gates were open, while for those who used to set the rules, they were closed. Ghana expanded its support for technical training programs at the same time, giving young Ghanaians the opportunity to pursue careers in mining, metallurgy, and mineral finance. Within months, new jobs were being produced in the value chain surrounding the mines rather than in the mines themselves. For the first time, gold wasn't simply making headlines. It was creating industries. However, none of this took place in a vacuum. It was the logical progression of the previously mentioned policy change. Traore has been admired by Ghana. It then imitated him. However, they exceeded even his goals in this stage. They did more than simply halt the bleeding. They began to develop new organs. Gold in Ghana was no longer considered a passive asset. Now it was a sword, a shield, and a lever. The nation had transformed from a victim of exports to a generator of value. Although gold laid the groundwork, the true change was yet to come. Because Ghana's economic policies did not have the greatest influence, other African countries started to observe and make notes in this way. The chain used to be made of gold. It had now turned into the key in Ghana's possession. Ghana wasn't merely creating riches by the time it changed its export regulations, boosted its reserves, and expelled shady international businesses. A blueprint was being built. However, a blueprint's true strength lies not in its aesthetic appeal. It lies in its copyability. And that's precisely what began to occur throughout Africa. Ghana was being keenly watched by other countries. A new question started to reverberate through the corridors of power, including presidential security briefings, parliaments, and embassies. Why can't we do it if Ghana can? It was more than envy. It was an epiphany. The previous model of dig, export, hope was found to be unsustainable. Ghana has demonstrated that there was an alternative, one that needed more guts than money. Ghana became a continental model at that very moment, having previously been a gold producer. Rumors of doing it the Ghanaian way started to circulate in state-controlled mining ministries in Mali, where political unrest had already strained relations with Western allies. For many years, officials had been worried that more than 60% of their gold was being siphoned off by influential foreign organizations, trafficked through shadow networks, or leaving the country unreported. Mali's transitional leaders, started creating plans for their own gold board after Ghana demonstrated what centralized monitoring could do in a few months. The lesson was even more evident in Nigeria, which is also experiencing economic difficulties following the breakup with France. You must have inner strength if you wish to endure loneliness. Reserves, not debt, are what you need. And managing your most plentiful natural resource is the best method to increase reserves. Even nations that are not currently subject to sanctions began to reconsider their organizational designs. Tanzania re-examined its local ownership regulations after battling international mining firms for a long time in its extensive gold belt. Under pressure from investors, discussions about restoring mandated value addition measures that had been put on hold years ago started to re-emerge. However, Zimbabwe, which has been plagued by international sanctions and long accused of economic incompetence, may have had the most emblematic moment. For many years, allegations of corruption and smuggling had plagued Zimbabwe's gold trade. However, a key economic advisor to the president publicly commended Ghana's gold model in early 2025, referring to it as a Pan-African response to colonial economics in the 21st century. It wasn't merely flattery, it was an indication of intent. Ghana's strategy was so straightforward that it spread like wildfire. Neither ideological revolutions nor military takeovers were necessary. Saying no to international regulations and yes to national interests called for something far more radical. The dominoes started to roll across the continent as a result of that mentality change from appeasement to assertion. Furthermore, Ghana did more than only encourage it. The nation started aggressively interacting with other African leaders through strategic summits, trade forums, and private encounters. In order to exchange technical know-how on tracking, refining, and dealing gold through state systems, Ghana Gold even established communication lines with regional partners. A model of African collaboration independent of the US and Europe was emerging for the first time in decades. It was not predicated on aid, loans, or charity. Its foundation was unadulterated wealth that was polished in-house and exchanged on African terms. The West was uneasy about that. Investor confidence was threatened when international mining groups started publishing reports regarding resource nationalism. Western think tanks made vague threats against Ghana and Burkina Faso, warning of the rise of authoritarian paradigms in resource governance. The question of whether this trend could jeopardize foreign direct investment was debated by financial journalists. However, they failed to see the purpose. The goal was not to deter investment. It had to do with altering that investment's regulations. African nations weren't refusing to work together. They were calling for alliances based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. And Ghana had demonstrated that it was possible to do this through strict internal control and policy rather than isolation. However, laws and export revenue may not be the most significant effects of Ghana's gold shift. It's in the field of psychology. Young people, business owners, engineers, and students all around Africa started discussing gold as a tool for empowerment rather than as a remote government issue. They realized that foreign wealth was not necessary. Here in Africa, it may be developed, safeguarded, and put to use. The spark was lit by Traore. Ghana fanned the flames. And now, across the continent, a bold new idea is taking hold. That freedom isn't just political, it's economic. And it can be measured in gold, not just in words. That's what makes this moment so powerful. When one nation breaks free and thrives, it sets off a chain reaction. Ghana's $3 billion wasn't just a payout. It was a message, a warning to those who've long profited from Africa's silence. The old game is over. A new era is rising, one where African nations claim the value of their own soil and shape their own destinies.